guys, in this tutorial we're going to learn how to prepare our paper for painting, and we're also going to learn how to use a limited palette to create a whole range of different colors and effects. So the first thing I'm going to do is wet down my paper. I'm just using Sea White 300 GSM paper, so I'm just going to wet that down. And I've put the under drawing on first. You want to use really basic shapes for this initial drawing. The purpose of wetting the paper is really just so that it doesn't buckle as it dries. And let's take that down. And you really should use masking tape for this. The reason I'm using clear tape is just because I've run out of masking tape. Okay, and I'm going to start by doing an underpainting using ultramarine. Cooler colors are good for shadows, and ultramarine is a really cool blue that's really good for using when you're creating form. Remember, you want to take the color out of the pan, so the ultramarine is next to the white, and mix it with water before you apply it to the page. And we're going to be painting while the page is still wet. So test out your color on the side of, like on a piece of scrap paper, or if you have something to hand. Oops, got a little bit of green there, that's fine. And we're gonna start by painting more or less the outline of the cat using really simple marks. I'm adding clear water to my brush right here. I'm blending down. I don't want to make this layer too heavy. I'm adding even more water, so at this point it's just water. And that's creating a graduated wash as we move through the painting. It's going to be a little bit darker on this side here, so I'm going to just drop in a little bit more ultramarine for this paw coming forwards. Tiny bit at the base of the back paw. And I'm keeping the paper super wet, so more wet than you normally would, because in this I'm going to actually use an effect that's sometimes thought of as a mistake in watercolor painting, which is I'm going to be dropping in color and letting it kind of bleed in irregular patterns throughout the cat to create the effect of fur. And I'm adding a good deal of water to the tail, and I'm going outside of the total area of the tail with a bunch of water. going to drop in a little bit more paint on the side of the legs here. Now on the side of the face. Now we want the paint to be wet for this next part. We're going to make two colors here. I'm going to take the ultramarine and with a clean brush, pick up some of the brown and mix these two together to create a black violet. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm also going to just mix up some plain brown. And now I'm going to just drop this in to the very wet paper. So you can add more water to make this fuzz out a bit. So my page here is super, super wet. One thing you can do is if you put down marks, you can put water in so that it just spreads out in between the different marks to create some of that overlapping fur texture. So if you find that the paint's just bleeding too far off the page, you can always pick it up, but I actually like this effect, this kind of loose effect. We're not really hiding the fact that we're using a water medium by trying to make it too perfect. I'm going to contrast the kind of floofy body with a more defined head, and then as the paint dries, slightly more defined paws. picking up some of the paint here on the side. Now, making sure that the tail is nice and quite wet, I'm now going to drop in that bluish black. I'm going to let that color create this sort of whirls on the cat. If you have a dry brush on hand, you can also experiment with how texture can be created by just flicking out some of this color. Notice how when you add water to that, it just pushes away some of the paint that's already down. I'm just going to jot in a little bit more tan there, and then let's move down the tail. Now here's where gravity can come into play. So I'm just going to lift this up, hold it kind of sideways because I want this fur to be moving kind of to the side. So I'm just holding my paper up. And while I'm holding it up, I'm going to just put down a brush or a little bit of paper to let these colors concentrate into different sections. Going to re-wet the body. Make some more of that black violet. And what we're seeing here is an example of how tone in color works. So we've made our own black by mixing together two colors of pretty high intensity tones, so they're dark. And that can create the illusion of a black while adding a little bit more depth than you would get using the black, because often black works to dull the colors, which can be useful in some settings, but in others, you don't want to be sort of purposely dulling down your watercolors or introducing too many variables. So with this, the benefit of working with a limited palette is that all the colors work together. And you'll be surprised at how many effects you can get using quite a limited palette. Another nice thing to do with watercolors is to contrast sharply defined edges with more loose areas where the paint is allowed to bleed into the surrounding area. And that just creates more of a natural effect because it mimics the way things are in the natural world. So we're not always looking just straight directly at something. We often have something in the periphery. And with watercolors, you can mimic that very natural effect of having some things blur into the periphery of your vision by using more water on your page in some areas and less water in others. Just going to add a bit of water to the side to let some of this paint bleed into the surrounding area and create that fur effect. And remember to use gravity. So if you want things to blend kind of further to the side, just move your paper in the direction of where you want the blend. You can also direct the flow just by having the water directed into bleeding into one point that you've placed either a brush or a bit of paper next to. I'm going to come in with some more browns in between the stripes on the body, so a bit of a warmer color, adding just a bit more variation. And now I need to be really patient and simply allow my paper to dry a bit so that I can come in with a few darker details. Before I do that, I'm just going to drop in just a few more stripes along the tail. I'm just dropping this in the middle of some of these stripes now as they kind of bleed into the surrounding area. So as the paper dries, this bleed is going to become less and less pronounced. It's going to move shorter and shorter distances when you put down the paint. It's not going to kind of travel along the water. So by working wet on wet with what we can, as the paint dries, we can create a variety of effects. Okay, and if you are like me and impatient and don't really like waiting, we can add a few just textural elements. So here, just going to do a few dots. Maybe a few dots of the brown. It's entirely up to you whether you do this or not. This is just, sometimes it's useful just to kind of show the viewer what medium you're using and part of the process. Can make things seem a little bit more intentional. Okay, so I got impatient and started using a hairdryer, so you can see little marks coming out, but I don't really mind those. I kind of like those marks. You do want to be careful though and not use a hairdryer at first on this, because we need to let our layers stain the paper. So we need to let the water absorb into the paper enough that when we use the hairdryer, if we use the hairdryer, it doesn't make them move around all over the place. And you can use a hairdryer actually to direct where the paint is flowing, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. So now I'm going to add in just some final details, and you'll notice that as I work on dry paper, the color comes out a lot darker and crisper. And I'm just going to create a graduated wash around certain areas. And that's when I put down paint on paper and then just put some water right next to it to direct it, to just create a gradient into. And this is just that blue-violet mixture. You can create some textured effects at this point. So either, thin brush strokes. You could use a dry brush technique if you have a dry brush on hand. There's a lot of different fun things that you can do at this point. Now I'm coming in with a darker color just in between the stripes of the cat. And where I want it to blend, just adding that water from side to side. And using this mix, instead of just going straight for the black, as you'll see as it goes along, creates just a much more rich composition. And I'm not going to do the entire cat. I'm just going to make some of the marks on this side a little bit darker just to show that effect of realism here. But I'm going to let it kind of, fade as we move towards the head. And that just has to do with laziness, to be honest. But I also think it creates a nice effect for the composition. Just have it partially finished, partially still fluid, and still very watercolory. I'm going to darken up this back leg, and I'm going to use the negative space around the fur to make it seem like wisps of fur are sort of coming into this back area. So it's a way of showing white fur is just to look at the negative space in between the furs, like I've done here. And then transitioning into a brown. Still focusing on the negative space as we move down. All right, and there we have it, a floofy watercolor cat using only 2 colors. So using a really simplified palette. And we'll continue to use this palette for a number of other different effects. So follow to watch more.